Tonight, we have a great presentation for you from our very own student farm manager over the Rutgers Gardens, Alex Sawatsky. I'm going to turn it over to Alex.
My name is Alex Sawatsky. I'm the student farm manager at the Rutgers Gardens here. I'm also a part-time instructor in the agriculture and food systems program at Rutgers. So here at the student farm, we grow food on about half an acre right now. Our goal is to expand to 1.5 acres to 2 acres over the next couple of years. And one of our main goals is to address food insecurity on the Rutgers campus, but also in the greater New Brunswick community. We also sell produce at the Cook's Market on Fridays and have a small CSA distribution as well. We have undergraduate interns that manage the student farm along with myself. This year we had 4 student interns working the farm. It provides them a great opportunity to get hands-on experience in farm fields. So I actually studied history in undergraduate, and after I graduated, decided to do wolfing down in Costa Rica. So I worked at a sustainable living center, environmental education center for 9 months, and that's where I fell in love with growing food. They were involved in a lot of natural building, but also beginning to do permaculture designs and implementations. And upon returning to the States, I figured that I would like to pursue farming and to see if I liked it. So I got an internship at a small organic farm in Pennsylvania. And after that season, I actually started my own farm. And that was down in Stockton, New Jersey in Hunterdon County. And that was in 2010. So for the next 8 years, I managed that farm, partnered up with the landowners. And then after a few years into that, I realized that I would like to teach sustainable agriculture. So a few years ago, I went back to school, got my master's in sustainable food systems, and then was hoping to get a job at a college or university and be able to teach the next generations of farmers. And as luck would have it, a couple years ago, this position opened up. So in 2019, I became the student farm manager here at Rutgers. So I love farming because it's such a gratifying and fulfilling vocation. Being able to grow fresh, healthy food and share it with my local community. It's hard for me to think of another vocation that's as positive in nature. Essentially, this is my office. Being outside, under the sun, playing in the dirt, and that's incredibly rewarding for me. I love the physicality of it. I love working with my hands. And then more of a kind of a philosophical approach answer would be, when I started farming, part of my goal was to contribute towards changing the way that food is produced and consumed in our world. And that, a decade later, that's still the same today.
Hi, everybody. I can't see you, but hopefully you can see me, and it's great to be here tonight to talk a little bit about growing organically in your backyard garden. So we're going to discuss 5 keys to a bountiful home garden, and this is kind of, working in tandem with nature. In terms of the 5 keys or the 5 tips that we're going to discuss tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about setting up your garden for success. So this obviously entails planning ahead and being prepared for the upcoming growing season. Second one is building healthy soil. This is really kind of the foundation of healthy crops. If you don't have healthy soil, you're not going to have healthy, nutrient-dense crops out of your garden. The third is to manage pests and diseases. I think if anybody's tried growing food on a large or small scale, pest and disease management is pretty vital in terms of getting good yields from your production space. Reducing weed pressure is a very vital aspect. I think, again, weeds are a bit relentless, and so to have a good weed management plan, even in your backyard garden, is very important. And then caring for your garden between crops, whether you're doing multiple successions in the same season or over the winter season. So before we get too far into these 5 tips, we're going to look a little bit at the background of what is organic, and then we're going to start a little bit with the history. This is just, I find this important because there's a lot of misconceptions out there in terms of what organic means, so we won't spend a lot of time on it, but just to provide some context to where we are today with the term organic and what it means to you and what it means to the general public and on a federal level as well. So the origins of the term organic as we know it today are from the 1930s and 40s. A couple gentlemen, Sir Albert Howard and Walter Northbourne, were the kind of pioneers of organic as we know it. Sir Albert Howard he described it as natural farming and also developed kind of the term, or coined the term, the law of return. So that means putting all kind of the organic material back into the earth in terms of nutrient cycling. And then Walter Northburn was the first to use the organic term in 1940. And he described, farm as kind of very similar to a biological organism. So a lot of kind of complex and intricate kind of interworkings amongst all the parts of the whole. And this was really kind of in opposition to industrial agriculture was doing, the explosion of kind of chemical introduction, fungicides and pesticides. At the center, at the foundation, as I mentioned previously, we're talking about soil, was really the heart of this philosophical revolution. And then it was really not until the 1960s where the kind of part of the counterculture movement and the environmental movement where organic began to really kind of pick up some momentum. And this is what kind of opened the door for the organic industry. So part of this, a lot of you have probably heard of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which talked about kind of the environmental consequences of the pesticides in terms of industrial agriculture. So the growing popularity equated to a need for standardization as organic was spreading across the country and different states were developing their own certification processes and standards. There was obviously a need for kind of a federal oversight of that. So, and this was to kind of assure that the food that was grown and labeled as organic was produced using specific certain practices. In 1990, the Organic Foods Production Act passed, and then this helped establish the National Organic Program that is still in place today, as well as the National Organic Standards Board. And even though this passed in 1990, it took 10 years to write the National Organic Standard and then another 2 years to implement it. So it's 2002 in terms of the organic certification program and standards that we know today, and that is known as the final rule. So this is a little above, the conversation that we're going to be having today. But just as a general consumer, I think it's important to know that the backstory of what certified organic mean. So what does it mean? In terms of certified organic, the USDA certified organic basically is following that final rule. So if you're ever interested in terms of what that entails, it's pretty easily accessible on the web that you can look up. Even though it says that organic producers rely on natural substances, there are some caveats. So misconceptions like organic does not necessarily mean no spray. It does not necessarily mean no chemicals. So even though things have the label USDA organic, it does not mean no spray or no chemicals. It just means that there are certain inputs and certain substances that are approved. In terms of what the original organic movement stood for, and some farmers and growers still stand behind today, slightly at odds with the certified organic understanding, but it's really kind of based on three main principles. The top one, and the one that we'll be focusing on mostly today, is practices that preserve the integrity of the environment while producing safe and healthy food. And then the last one, whole and unprocessed, unadulterated food, is also relevant to our conversation too. So in terms of what does organic mean, for you personally, it can kind of mean whatever you want it to mean. But in terms of the USDA label, in terms of the inputs that are approved, the certified organic is the final rule that you want to follow. So back to the 5 keys or 5 tips to growing food organically, working with nature, and maximizing your harvest. The first one, as I mentioned, is setting your garden up for success. So a big part of this is just planning ahead. In farming in general, but especially in organic farming, there are very few quick fixes. So that means in terms of fertility, pest and disease control, things take time. Building soil is an example. A nutrient dense soil and healthy soil takes years. So you kind of have to plan ahead. You can't expect to break in new ground, the same spring that you want to plant. So prepare the season before, the fall before your garden space, and that way you're ready to go for when the growing season arrives in early spring. That also means gathering the proper supplies and inputs that you may be using during the growing season. If you're going to be using insect netting or other barriers or certain fertilizers, you want them ahead of time rather than taking more of a reactionary approach, especially in organic farming, this is very important to always be playing from behind. Is not going to yield you very productive growing space. The second kind of element of setting up your garden for success is growing in context. And now a lot of this is kind of covered. I think Angela Monahan did a earlier talk on this in an episode, like season 1, preparing the garden. So I'm not going to get too deep into it, but in terms of our conversation, a lot of it just means choosing the right crops for the right season and the appropriate conditions. One example of this is if you have a decent amount of shade in a growing space, you wouldn't want to plant something like tomatoes there that need full sun. So this is important in terms of not only yield, but also in terms of being preventative against things like disease. You also want to maximize space. So as you're kind of planning out your garden for the year, oftentimes home growers are limited in the amount of space they have. So maximize that. You want a high yielding garden, and you also want to keep your soil covered to protect it. So this picture on the right hand side is at the Rutgers Gardens. We have planted lettuce, beets around the same time in early April, and then we have tomatoes and direct seeded Japanese turnips down the center of the row. So as the lettuce matures first, that'll get harvested out, provide more space for the beets and the tomatoes and the turnips, and then the beets will come out, and then the turnips, and then you'll have plenty of room and airflow for your tomatoes. So you're getting 4 crops out of a single growing space. The caveat here is more is not always better. Resource competition is real, meaning all plants need sufficient nutrient and water. So too many plants in too small of a space, they're going to be fighting for those resources. There's a lot of parallels between plants and people. So if you consider having too many people in an area, in a community, and not enough resources, water and food to go around, things aren't going to go well for the population. Same going with the crops. And airflow is vital. I know it's tempting to put as many plants in a space as possible to really try to squeeze out everything that it's worth, but at the same time, if things don't have proper airflow and can't breathe and can't dry out, you're going to have a lot of issues with disease. I mean, whether it's plants, whether it's wood, organic material, or your armpits or your toes, if things stay wet too long, things are going to get a little funky. So same applies for growing space and airflow. The second key to a bountiful garden is building your healthy soil. This is really kind of the first and top priority here that you should be looking into. And the 4 pillars of soil care are encouraging biodiversity, maximize photosynthesis, which means having as many plants on the soil as possible, and in terms of not only space, having no bare soil, but also over time too, so not having large gaps between having plants on your soil, minimizing disturbance, and maximizing soil coverage. And the goals of those pillars are to improve soil structure, preserve soil ecosystem, minimize erosion, increase soil organic matter, increase biological activity and biodiversity, and reduce the leaching of nutrients. And that last one, not only in terms of protecting our waterways and resources, but also if you keep the nutrients in your ground, in your soil, you're going to have more productive plants moving forward. So soil that's alive, that's what we're really going for here. Soil that is alive. Otherwise, it's just a inert medium. You might as well be doing hydroponics, but we really want soil that's alive. And this will contribute to your fertility, disease resistance, and pest prevention in the long term. The soil food web is essentially, it's the foundation of our food web. So if you don't have healthy live soil, you're not going to have healthy plants, nor healthy animals or human beings that eat the plants. The third key to success is managing pests and disease. So this is a big one. This is one that probably most home gardeners struggle with. And prevention is really your best asset here. Prevention. And this starts with proper planning and implementation. So for both pest and disease, crop rotation is big. So I know, again, space can be limited in the backyard. But as much as you can, not only rotate your crops in space, but also over time. So that means in physical space, but also between when you bring back a crop to a specific spot. The general recommendation is often around 4 years for crop rotation, if possible. So that's what you're kind of hoping to do to prevent disease and pest outbreaks. Companion planting is also a good option for pest deterrents, and that can be in the form of using, fragrant herbs or different flowers like nasturtiums or marigolds that kind of mask the crop smell, so your pests can't locate them as well. Physical barriers may be one of the biggest assets you can use in your backyard. It's something that we rely on very heavily at the student farm. In the picture over here, we have a bed of arugula, and if you can see at the top, kind of lifted up to take the picture, is insect netting. So it's like a very fine kind of screen material. It still allows light and air through. It's not as heavy as like a row cover or remay, but it keeps out everything from tiny insects to rabbits, squirrels, groundhogs, etc. So we use that on a lot of crops this time of year, as much as we can until the crops are too large, or if we're having to, trellis or stake certain vegetable plants. Beneficial insects can also be an asset to you. So that's another reason why you want to limit spraying, even if you use organic products, because some organic products are still broad spectrum, meaning they can still impact and harm your beneficial populations. So you really want those ladybugs, those lacewings, those parasitic wasps to be on your side and to help you. If you eliminate all the pests, then you're not going to have any beneficials, and then you're going to be in a constant state of having to do reactive control or therapeutic control. In terms of disease, crop rotation, as I mentioned, is vital, but also sufficient spacing, as I mentioned before, with airflow. Pest control is very important, and I say this because every wound on a plant is comparable to the wound. If you have a bunch of many small cuts on you, the chance of some of them getting infected is pretty high. So if you picture a plant that gets, nibbled by flea beetles or, by a cabbage worm, all those are potential vectors for disease. It's an open wound where pathogens can enter. And then another recommendation, something very important to remember, is try to stay out of your garden when it's wet. This is especially important when you're talking about something like your tomatoes and peppers and whatnot, because diseases spread very easily when the conditions are wet outside. Sometimes it's impossible to stay out, but as much as you can, especially when it's dewy or if it's raining, just wait till the next day to do any work. You have to trellis or stake or do anything like that. This little Venn diagram here kind of shows the 3 elements that need to be present for disease to take hold. You need a pathogen to be present, you need a conducive environment, and you also need a susceptible host. So in terms of organic gardening, we're really kind of trying to address the environment and make the host not susceptible. In kind of conventional agriculture, industrial agriculture, they're really trying to focus on they focus on eliminating the pathogen. So with chemical sprays and controls. So if you create healthy crops that are not as susceptible, and you provide an environment with cultural controls with proper spacing and good sun where you need it so things can dry out, then you're a lot less likely to get a disease issue. It's the same as, a human being, again, is if you're properly fed and hydrated and well rested, you have the nutrients and minerals that you need, you have good gut health, you're less likely to get sick, even though there's pathogens and germs, viruses floating around all the time. So again, preventative controls are the best, but sometimes you may have to do reactionary methods. And for pests, this can include hand picking, human control. You can kind of sometimes, depending if it's aphids or something, you can use a strong water jet from a hose or from a spray bottle to knock them off the ground or onto the ground. Depending on the size of your growing space, human control in terms of picking, and as long as you're being vigilant out there, is very viable option. The other option for pest control once you have an outbreak is to do to use an input. So these would be kind of OMRI approved inputs. And so this is the Organic Materials Review Institute. So unless the product has this label on it, it is not approved for organic use. And this can be a little confusing because sometimes products can be branded in a way that make them seem like they're approved organically, but you're really looking for this label. The other one that's beneath that, the label at the bottom for organic production, that can be found on kind of home gardening inputs, which may not have the OMRI label, but they've been approved by the EPA to be used for non-commercial use. So they meet the same standards as the USDA has out for the national organic, but it's only for residential use. Disease mitigation. There are homemade remedies out there. You can use Google or the internet to find them. I've used kind of a milk diluted spray for powdery mildew on rosemary. There's, baking soda remedies but you can feel free to do some sleuthing and searching. But there are homemade remedies for disease mitigation. And again, there's also OMRI approved inputs as well that you can purchase through your gardening store or online. This is one good resource here. It has a number of different pests, and if it had the full document below, it has fungicides and different diseases that you'll encounter, and then the different kind of products or inputs that you could purchase to use to control them. And it's a pretty easy graphic to follow, so you can kind of use the different information above where it says the product names and then what your actual insect or pest is. There's also physical controls as well at the bottom of the document. In terms of reducing weeds, this is the next kind of key to a successful gardening operation. So the first and foremost would be using organic mulches. And so you can use straw, leaves, grass clippings, newspaper, cardboard, wood chips. Obviously, there are pros and cons to almost all of them. Bill and I were just talking about some of the cons of some of these organic, especially straw or leaves can really harbor some pests like slugs. So you're controlling one pest, which is the weed, but you're kind of creating a habitat for another. So you kind of have to pick your poison a little bit, but there are benefits to all of them. Grass clippings is one that you have to be a little careful with, especially when they're fresh, because they can kind of burn plants, especially young seedlings, because they're high in nitrogen. They do break down quickly, so unless you have a lot of them, they're not as an adequate mulch unless it's put on very thick. Wood chips you'd probably want to use mostly in your pathways and aisles, unless you have some perennial plants. You still don't want to get too close with the wood chips. If you mix the wood chips into your soil, you're going to have some nitrogen tie-up problems. So mostly use that for your pathways, but pathways are also important to keep the weeds down as well. In terms of straw, you definitely want to use straw versus hay. Hay often has weed seeds in it. Straw can too, but it's more likely that hay is going to have just add to your weed seed bank. So you want to avoid hay as much as possible. Your other options, you use synthetic mulch. So you can use things like landscape fabric. You can find at your local gardening store or hardware store. You can put around the plants. You can use in your aisleways. I would recommend landscape fabric over kind of plastic or polyculture, just because you can reuse the landscape fabric from year after year. If you do use it on, say, to plant your tomatoes or peppers or cucumbers into it, you may want to disinfect it or sanitize it between seasons, so you're not kind of contributing to next year's disease issues. Another very important way that you can reduce weeds is using kind of no dig or minimal dig or till. And the reason for this is that, the heavy majority of the weed seeds that are germinating are in the top few inches of your soil. So if you're constantly turning over your soil every year or between plants, you're just bringing up new weed seeds. So if you can kind of work on depleting that weed seed bank in the top few inches of your soil, then over time, over a couple of years, you can really reduce your weed pressure in your garden. This is also better for your soil anyway. This picture here is mycorrhizal fungi. So these networks that form with your plant roots that really kind of expand the reach for nutrients and water. And so if you think about tilling or disturbing the soil a lot, you're breaking up all those potential networks for future plantings, and all of the soil life that's in your soil as well. It's comparable to a deforestation if you're thinking about something on a larger scale. So if you take away the habitat, you're going to lose, the life that's living there is either going to vacate or it's going to die. Same thing with tilling soil. You do need to be careful if you are doing no dig or no till, that you want to not bring in additional weed seeds. So the compost that you use should be weed seed free, and likewise the mulches as well. This also requires you to be a little more vigilant in your kind of weed control over a couple of years, because if you let more weeds go to seed, then you're just going to exacerbate your problem from year to year. Just got a comment on the cardboard and newspaper. You can use that to smother weeds and to provide a mulch. You probably want to put some heavier material on top, like a light layer of compost or straw. It's great smother material. You do want to make sure that you're not using, you want to use natural dyes. We had a farm that I know that had a pizza box collection project. So for over winter, they put out the word that they were looking for used pizza boxes, and they mulched their entire probably quarter acre of garlic with it. So it's definitely a viable option. It does break down over time. In the meanwhile, it provides great kind of weed suppression. And one final thing here talking about is caring for your garden between crops. And this is a very important concept as well. And I have one major point to make about it, and that is protect your soil. So whether it's kind of between plantings, as I mentioned before, you're doing a spring planting and then you're putting something in for the fall or for the summer, you don't want to leave your soil exposed. And that's for a number of reasons, right? You have erosion issues, your nutrients are leaching, and so your soil is not being fed as well. So you can use kind of organic covers or synthetic. These are pictures from the student farm. So we use both a combination of leaves. We use compost. Compost can be considered a cover or mulch for your soil because it does protect it from erosion, but what it doesn't do is prevent the nutrients from leaching out of it. And then we also have used tarps as well. Again, it does provide some nice benefits. It does prevent erosion and leaching. It also warms the soil nicely in the spring before the regular soil temps would otherwise, and it increases biological activity in that way. But it doesn't provide photosynthesis. So in terms of feeding your soil, you don't really have that carbon flow from plants, turning carbon into sugars and carbohydrates and feeding the soil. Cover crops is another great way to cover your soil over the between plantings. This is a little more advanced for the home gardener, but there are some simple ways to kind of implement them or try them out. The picture here is kind of oats and peas, and that's kind of a very basic cover crop combination to start with. You can use them in late summer. They'll get good growth on, and then they'll winter kill. So meaning you don't have to worry about termination, because termination, meaning killing your cover crops so you can plant your crops, your food, can be a little complicated in terms of you either have to mow or till or tarp or smother. So winter kill cover crops are a great way to start out and give it a try. And I do have a fact sheet on that from NJES on cover crops and green manures that I can share maybe at the end of the talk here. So cover crops do some of the same things as, mulching or using inorganic materials to cover your soil with. They prevent erosion, they prevent nutrient leaching. Some cover crops are known as catch crops, so they'll catch and hold and store the excess nutrients that are in the soil. And then as they get terminated or killed, they kind of release that for the subsequent crop. They also, some of them add fertility. Your legumes, so your beans and peas and clovers, those are nitrogen fixers, so they convert atmospheric nitrogen into soluble nitrogen in the soil. And then there's other certain crops like a buckwheat might mine phosphorus from deep down in the subsoil layers that might not readily be accessible to your crops. Adding organic matter, again, different cover crops provide different amounts. So certain things like, peas or buckwheat that are very tender, they're going to break down a lot quicker, and so they won't add as much carbon, as much organic matter to your soil as would grasses like oats or rye or something like that. You do want to be careful because something like using rye, which can overwinter and provide, have a green space throughout the winter time, can be very difficult to control in the spring. So just before you kind of implement any cover crop plan, just be careful and know the potential challenges and drawbacks of using that specific one. Reducing compaction, some cover crops are better than others in terms of really breaking up soil compaction. So again, in terms of reducing tillage, you can rely on some cover crops to loosen your soil. Some things like tillage radish, or that also winter kill, will drive a taproot deep down, and then they'll winter kill and kind of decay over the winter as well. Feeding the soil may be one of the most important attributes in terms of using cover crops, because you're, again, having living plants on your soil, which is one of the most important aspects of healthy soil, is feeding the soil. If you remember nothing else from this conversation, I want you to remember that you want to feed the soil, not the crop, that preventative measures are best, and to protect your soil. So feeding the soil, not the crop, that means not using soluble fertilizers. That's really important in organic production. So that's where the nutrients are coming from the soil. We're not using soluble fertilizers that can provide quick growth, but potentially leach out into our soil and waterways. Preventative measures are best, because being reactive in organic farming, there are very few quick fixes. And protecting your soil, because soil is your lifeblood, your lifeline, and that's your foundation for a healthy and bountiful garden.
We do have some questions. Do you want to just elaborate on some of the cover crops that you've had success with and why?
So in the spring or in the late summer, the oats and peas are a very good combination. They're quick growing. Oftentimes, depending on what you use, if you're using something like clover, it can germinate quickly, but it doesn't necessarily flesh out as much. So you need almost like a companion cover crop with that. Otherwise, you're going to have weed issues. So something quick growing like oats can be very useful because it establishes quickly and shades out potential weed problems. Buckwheat's a very easy and easy cover crop to implement and to use, to dip a toe in the cover crop game. You can use it in very short windows during the summer. So it only is in terms of maybe 4 to 5 weeks to maturity. You wouldn't use it in the colder months because it is frost sensitive. But if you have an open growing space in the summertime, establishes very quickly, matures quickly, and provides great habitat and pollen for pollinators. If beautiful white flowers on there, and it shades out weeds very quickly. So those are some of the ones that I've used a lot. Vetch is a very good one. Hairy vetch. Again, it kind of provides nice biomass, but also nitrogen fixation. So that's one that you could seed late in the fall. I know some of the challenge of growing in your backyard is you want to have food in the ground as long as possible. So oftentimes people aren't shutting down their garden until maybe, Thanksgiving, maybe even a little later if they're trying to, leave some carrots in for that optimal sweetness. So in that case, you don't really have many options. Vetch, hairy vetch, and rye are some of the crops that you can cover crops that you can plant the latest, like in early November. But after that, you probably have to just use organic mulches to kind of cover your growing space. Really, once you kind of get a little used to using cover crops and get accustomed to it, you can kind of expand your repertoire and start doing cover crop cocktails, because each one fills a different niche and diversity really kind of fills all those holes. So if you think about, a community of people, and you have, a doctor and a carpenter and a teacher, etc., but you don't have a farmer, then everyone's going to go hungry. And so the cover crops works in a similar way, in that each cover crop provides some attributes, but not all. So diversity is best, but that can get a little complicated again, especially with termination. In terms of the backyard termination, really you want, especially in the springtime, you want your cover crop to reach maturity, so flowering but not going to seed, because you can have issues with cover crops becoming weeds if you allow them to set seed. But if they're flowering, that means all the energy is going into reproduction, and then you can kind of flatten them out. You can roll them, you can crimp them, you can just knock them down with a board, and then you can smother them with a tarp or something for a few weeks. And then you'll have you can either use an in situ mulch in that case, so meaning like you can leave the residue in place and you can plant into it, or you can rake off the residue to the aisles if you need a finer seed bed.
Okay, we have a few questions here, which, I'm just going to read one out loud to you and let you go for it. I joined a community garden and tilled my plot soil mid-April, then planted flower seeds in May. Now the seedlings are coming up, but the weeds are out competing them. What can I do, or what did I do wrong?
So really starting your plants indoors is a great way to get a jump on weeds. That's my biggest recommendation, is to start with seedlings when you can. There are a few crops that you can't do this with, like carrots or some things that don't transplant well. But what I would say with 90% of crops, you can start indoors. So sometimes you may not have the right conditions in your house, whether it's warmth or lighting, to start seedlings. But then I would recommend maybe buying your plant starts from a garden center or a sale. The master gardeners do a sale every year, plant starts. So starting your plants, whether it's flowers or vegetables, from seed in your garden, you're going to have to be very vigilant with weed control. Stale seed bedding is an option as well. So that just means you're intentionally allowing, once you've kind of prepared your garden space, you can intentionally allow the weed seeds to germinate, and then you kill them off, and then you plant. So it does require a little extra step, a little extra time of a week or two to go through that process, but it's definitely worth it if you have the time to do that. Stale seed bedding is what it's called.
Okay, we have a question here. Nowadays, it seems everyone is growing organic. What are some ways to identify fraudsters or labeling to look out to make sure the product is as advertised?
So yeah, that's a very good question. In terms of people that are selling food and labeling their product as organic, there are pretty strict regulations in terms of whether it's selling at a farmer's market. You can't even really say using organic practices in your branding, officially. There might be some markets that let that slide or don't know what to look out for. But I'd say for the most part, if you're in kind of like a official marketplace, a farmer's market or a grocery store, you're not going to have much, well, I shouldn't say much fraud, because in industrial organics, we have heard about, the importation of fraudulent organics and whatnot. Ultimately, my best recommendation for you is to know your farmer. If you know your farmer, you can talk to them about their growing practices and you can have that relationship, then that really kind of increases trust. Because there is even in industrial organics, the practices that are used now do not necessarily align with the original philosophy from the 30s and 40s and 60s. So there is a new add-on label that's been created in the past couple of years called the Real Organic Project. So some farms are starting to use that just to kind of, there's a handful of additions that are not covered in the USDA version of certified organic, that some of these proponents of, for example, food that should be grown in soil, right? So hydroponic organics is permitted, but the Real Organic Project is saying that, food that's labeled organic should be inherently grown in soil. You shouldn't be able to have organic food without soil attached to it.
Great. We have a question here regarding crop rotation. My garden is only 6 feet by 15 feet. I grow tomatoes, eggplants, and cucumbers. How would I rotate crops, and would I not grow anything every other year? So you want to take a stab at that one?
So yeah, I would definitely recommend moving your tomatoes and your tomatoes and eggplant are in the same family. Some of them are going to be affected by different diseases. Cucumbers are in the cucurbit family. But you may want to try introducing another crop, or maybe grow something on the front end of the season or the back end when tomatoes aren't ready to go in the ground yet. Throwing in some other crops, even if you don't have the space to rotate immensely over from one year to the next. If you have, say, plant radishes or lettuce or something between your solanaceous or your tomatoes and your eggplants from year to year, that can help kind of break up disease and pest cycles as well.
And someone here had a problem growing their eggplants, and they wanted tips on how to grow the very best eggplant.
Well, eggplant, it does like very kind of, it thrives in hot and dry weather. So one, don't overwater it is a good recommendation. Make sure it gets full sun. It does, need a decent amount of fertility. And in terms of fertility for organic production, you can get some granular fertilizers that are made from, soybean meal or alfalfa meal, blood meal. Some have compost in or colloidal phosphate. So again, just look out for the OMRI approved sticker and add that into your compost and mix it in with your soil. So starting off with the healthy soil is really vital. One thing that I found with growing eggplant is you really want to provide early protection from flea beetles. The solanaceous flea beetle can be devastating to eggplants, and they look like exactly what the name implies, tiny little beetles that are fleas. They look like tiny beetles, and they are, but they also look like fleas. And so what happens is they make your plant look like lace. So they kind of nibble on your plants, and if you don't protect your seedlings, they can withstand a little flea beetle pressure when they're older, but when they're young, they really need protection. So that's where I really recommend the insect netting until your eggplants start to flower, and then you'll need to uncover them so the flowers can be pollinated.
And let's see. Oh, Cook's Market. Why don't you tell us exactly where that's located for people that want to be able to go there?
So Cook's Market, it's at Rutgers Gardens. The best GPS address is 130 Log Cabin Road in New Brunswick. So the garden is a beautiful place to be, but it's also Cook's Market's on Fridays, every Friday from right now it's 11 to 3 until Thanksgiving, and then it shifts to winter hours, which is 11 to 1.
And what type of flowers do you particularly use to attract beneficial insects?
Certain flowers that are best for a lot of beneficials are called umbellifers. So they have flowering shape that looks kind of like an umbrella. So if you've ever seen kind of wild Queen Anne's lace or wild carrot, that's an umbellifer. In terms of what you can use is like dill and cilantro are great options, because not only can you plant them to harvest as a herb, as a crop, but then when you're done with them, or they start to kind of be a little less productive or start to yellow or reach the end of their productive lifespan, you can let them go to seed. So they can double as both culinary herb for you, but then also when you're done with them, let them go to seed, and they can provide wonderful attractant for beneficial insects. You can also do that with other crops too, something like arugula. If your arugula begins to bolt, instead of pulling it out, you can let it go to flower, and it can also be a beneficial attractant as well.
And one thing that we've had really good luck with was bronze fennel and the dills, like you were saying. They really tend to attract a wide range of beneficial wasp, taconid wasp.
Yeah, it's the shape of the flower allows the insect to access a lot better access than some other flowering shapes.
But to make sure that when we use netting, that we cover the plants completely that need to be covered, but then when they start to flower, we have to uncover those plants that need pollination. So that's something we're very careful with, but with a lot of our greens, we can basically keep those covered with the netting, and that prevents a lot of insect problems. So for many organic gardeners, greens are a good option because they can keep them covered, and they can, because of the fast growing cycle, you don't have any pest problems. Or if you do, you can keep those pests under control just by covering those plants, and you can develop or create a small tunnel over the plants themselves, or just cover the plants directly with netting. But you have to bury the edges of that netting if you don't want those harmful insects to get in and start feeding on your plants. So, and what do you guys do besides that out there at your Rutgers gardens to keep plants healthy and keep insects off?
That's a big one that we do. We don't really do any kind of spraying out there. So preventative controls is the biggest one regarding the netting. We have big rabbit and groundhog problems, so the netting not only keeps the insects out, but it also keeps the rodents out as well. And we use kind of wire hoops with sandbags on the edges to keep them down. There are also some biological controls that you can use for, a major pest that probably home gardeners, but also commercial gardeners deal with is the cabbage worm or other caterpillars on the brassicas, the cabbage crops. So BT is a product that's kind of a bacteria that only impacts caterpillars, right? So that's very important to consider. I mentioned it earlier, but kind of glazed over it. But when you're looking at kind of organic pest controls in terms of reactive inputs, you want to be careful that you're not harming your beneficial populations. So the ones that are listed as broad spectrum, meaning that they impact all insects or a number of insects rather than one specific type. You want to be careful if you do have to do any kind of spraying with that, you're not spraying when, say, your bees are out. So late evening or very early morning would be the best time to do any kind of spraying like that.
And there are specific BTs depending on the type of caterpillars you're trying to control. And there are some products that are OMRI approved as well. So it's just a matter of, if you really want to go organic, make sure that your products are reviewed by the OMRI group. Somebody's looking to grow indoor plants, limited space. Let's see, use grow lights. Is that considered organic? Inside. So I'm going to let you try to answer that first. Go ahead. About growing and maintaining your organic production, but doing it inside the house.
Yeah, like I was mentioning before, like hydroponic production, right, can be done indoors, essentially with a soilless medium, and all your kind of nutrients are soluble. So feeding your plants via irrigation systems. So you can definitely do quote unquote organic growing inside. It's just a matter of any inputs that would use. So if you are growing in a soil indoors, if you're buying a potting mix, and if you want it to be aligned with the national standards, then it needs to be OMRI approved. General products like raw materials, leaves, straw, etc., those do not have to be OMRI approved as long as they're not processed. If you were trying to get certified organic, you'd have to submit something to your agent just saying that this hasn't been sprayed with anything, or if we used to get horse manure, and so the material only included the bedding and etc. So you need a letter from the supplier of your input describing what's in it and what it's made of. Bill, did you have anything to add to that in terms of indoor growing?
Yeah, just with indoor growing, as long as you have conditions, you can use supplemental lighting. There's no problem with that. And you can use OMRI-approved materials if insects do get in the house. And it's a matter of making sure you provide enough light for those plants inside. So many times if people are growing inside, they may have indoor grow lights, but try to bring in some light from the outside as much as possible so that the plants don't get leggy. Leggy plants tend to be weaker and have more problems. So adding as much light as you possibly can, growing them on the south side of your house where you've got a lot of windows, is going to be a big help. Providing good air circulation so that you don't have to use any chemicals. Just by providing good air circulation, we can reduce on disease inoculum by a great deal. Also, there's a question here, which I think is, will marigolds planted next to eggplant keep flea beetles away?
That's a good question. I've never I've never tried to use marigolds in that specific way. I know they're used sometimes with potatoes and potato beetle, but I have not read any literature that suggests that they work against flea beetles. The internet might be able to tell you one way or the other, but I think, marigolds in general is a great flowering plant, a companion plant to have in your garden.
In our experience, we do grow French marigolds where we had nematode problems. And at the end of the season, or a certain part of the season, we actually work those marigolds into the soil to decrease the nematode populations. You can do the same thing by growing sorghum and other crops in areas. Usually you don't grow sorghum in a small garden, but it has compounds in it called sorgo-leone, which can actually decrease nematode populations. But the marigolds themselves, I have not seen them actually decrease flea beetles because we do have a lot of marigolds interspersed within our garden, and we still get some flea beetles. So, and I have not seen research that indicates that it does control them. So, and then someone asked, how do you keep caterpillars away from dill? Do you have any suggestions for that?
I'm assuming you're talking about the parsley worm that goes after parsley and dill.
That's what I believe they're talking about. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, I would just handpick those and move them somewhere else because those are swallowtails. So I wouldn't try to deter them. We need them as pollinators. So maybe just grow a little extra dill or pick them up and move them to a different location. That's a pest that we want around.
That's a really good point as we wrap up here that, in integrated pest management, which we always stress, just because you see something doesn't mean you have to take active control. A lot of times you can, in a small garden situation, you can simply be your own biological control and remove that insect by hand. If you actually take control of the insect problem right when it starts to become a problem, or you introduce beneficial insects right in the very beginning, you'll actually get better control. So even within greenhouse settings, what we do is we'll bring in beneficials and have banker plants that will feed on those beneficials, and then in turn start to feed on the harmful insects when they do come in. So getting early control, making sure we have proper aeration, good air circulation throughout the garden goes a big way to reduce disease problems as well. I want to thank you, Alex, for doing a great hour, and you generated a lot of questions. And this is a great presentation. So we greatly appreciate you sharing your expertise with everyone. Alex, have a great night, and I hope everyone enjoyed tonight's lecture. Stay safe, everybody.